Just a few years ago, if someone told you that Chinese car brands would start beating European automakers on their own turf, you might have laughed. Europe was the birthplace of the automobile, home to names like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, and Audi, brands that shaped global car culture for over a century. China, meanwhile, was mostly seen as a manufacturing base, producing low-cost vehicles that rarely impressed Western buyers. But today, the tables have turned, fast. Across Europe's highways and city streets, Chinese electric vehicles are becoming an increasingly common sight. Sleek, quiet, and surprisingly affordable, models from brands like BYD, NIO, and MG are now competing head-to-head with Europe's traditional giants. In just a few years, China has gone from an industry follower to a global leader. Not by imitation, but through relentless innovation and scale. Let's put this into perspective. In 2024, around 65% of the world's electric vehicles were produced in China. That means for every 10 EVs sold globally, about 6 or 7 rolled off a Chinese assembly line. And, many of those cars are now being shipped straight to Europe, a region that once prided itself as the pinnacle of automotive excellence. For European automakers, this shift feels like an earthquake. Their market share is being chipped away, not by familiar rivals like Japan or the United States, but by newcomers from a country that was barely on the radar 2 decades ago. And for European leaders, this isn't just an economic issue. It's personal. Cars are part of Europe's identity, a symbol of its industrial power and technological sophistication. Watching their home market gradually dominated by Chinese brands has triggered alarm bells across Brussels and Berlin. The European Union, long an advocate of free trade, is no longer sitting quietly. Behind closed doors, discussions have turned into action, investigations, tariffs, and new rules designed to push back against what they see as China's unfair advantage. But none of those measures have stopped China's momentum. Instead, Europe's EV market is becoming a battlefield, where old champions are fighting to stay relevant against a fast, fearless challenger. And now, after years of quiet competition, things have reached a breaking point. The European Union has sent its clearest, most forceful message yet to China's electric vehicle industry: hand over your technology or get out of Europe. Once Europe realized how quickly Chinese electric vehicles were taking over, it became clear that this wasn't just about car sales, it was about control of the future. And Europe wasn't alone in feeling threatened. Across the Atlantic, the United States had already declared its own technological battle with China. In 2024, the United States launched a wave of new restrictions targeting what it called connected vehicles from China, cars equipped with systems like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and satellite communications. Officials claimed that these features could pose national security risks, suggesting that Chinese-made vehicles might collect sensitive data or even be remotely accessed. But to many industry experts, the move looked less about security and more about strategy, a way to slow down a competitor that was moving too fast. At the same time, Washington reinstated Section 301 tariffs, the same tool used during earlier trade wars. Tariffs on Chinese-made EVs jumped from 25% to 100%, effectively doubling prices overnight. Even the components needed to build EVs, such as batteries, graphite, and rare minerals, were hit with new taxes. The message was simple. If Chinese companies tried to sell high-tech cars or parts to American consumers, they would pay a heavy price. But the United States didn't stop there. American officials began quietly warning their allies, especially in Europe, not to let Chinese companies build EV factories on their soil. They argued that such investments could allow China to bypass tariffs and gain deeper control of Western markets from the inside. Europe took note. Within months, the European Union began drafting its own series of countermeasures. It started with anti-subsidy investigations, claiming that Chinese automakers received unfair government support that allowed them to sell cars at artificially low prices. Then came proposals for higher import tariffs and stricter market entry rules, all under the familiar language of protecting fair competition. Publicly, European leaders said these steps were necessary to create a level playing field. But behind the polished statements, there was a deeper fear that Europe's century-old automotive empire was at risk of losing its crown. And this time, it wasn't just an economic contest. The battle had evolved into something much bigger, a geopolitical and technological struggle over who will control the next era of global transportation, data, and energy. Because in the electric vehicle age, cars aren't just machines anymore. They're computers on wheels, powered by software, data, and batteries. Whoever controls those technologies doesn't just sell cars, they shape the future. And Europe, realizing how far behind it has fallen, is preparing to fight back with its toughest demand yet. By late 2024, Europe's frustration had reached a boiling point. Tariffs, investigations, and warnings weren't slowing China down. Instead, Chinese EV makers kept gaining ground, offering stylish, high-performance cars that undercut European prices by thousands of euros. So Brussels decided to take a more aggressive path, one that went far beyond taxes or trade disputes. The European Union began drafting a new regulation that would change the rules for any Chinese company wanting to invest or operate within Europe. On paper, the regulation looked like standard industrial policy. It required foreign investors to meet certain localization conditions, using a set percentage of EU-made components, hiring local workers, and contributing to the regional economy. But buried within the proposal was the most controversial requirement of all technology transfer. In simple terms, if a Chinese EV company wanted to build cars in Europe, it would have to share parts of its core technology, from battery systems and energy management software to manufacturing processes. Essentially, Europe was saying, if you want access to our market, you have to give us your secrets. For China, this crossed a red line. These technologies, the power batteries, the drive systems, and the vehicle control software, were exactly what had propelled China to the front of the global EV race. They represented more than a decade of innovation, research, and massive investment. It's worth noting the irony here. Decades ago, Western corporations used the same strategy when expanding into developing countries. They demanded joint ventures, local ownership, and technology sharing as the price of access. Now the situation has flipped. Europe, once the teacher, is trying to take a page from its own old playbook, this time aimed at China. The EU's motivation wasn't entirely hidden. European leaders openly admitted they wanted to secure their place in the rapidly evolving EV supply chain. By pushing Chinese companies to share technology, they hoped to rebuild Europe's manufacturing base and ensure that the continent wouldn't be left behind as the world moved away from fossil fuels. But from China's point of view, the message sounded less like cooperation and more like coercion. No automaker, not BYD, not KTL, not NIO, was willing to hand over its most valuable intellectual property just to keep selling in Europe. And as tensions rose, a new question emerged. If Europe was targeting Chinese technology, what exactly was it after? What piece of the puzzle was so important that the EU was willing to risk a trade war to get it? The answer lies at the very heart of every electric vehicle: the power battery. To understand why Europe is so determined to get its hands on Chinese electric vehicle technology, you have to look at what really powers the EV revolution: the battery. In a world shifting away from gasoline, the power battery has become the new engine, the beating heart of every electric vehicle. It determines how far a car can drive, how fast it charges, and even how safe it is. Whoever controls battery technology doesn't just build cars. They control the foundation of the entire EV ecosystem. And in this race, China is far ahead. Over the past decade, Chinese companies quietly built an industrial empire around battery production. Giants like CATL, or contemporary Amperex Technology Limited, and BYD invested billions into research, efficiency, and raw material sourcing. Today, they don't just dominate, they define the market. As of 2025, China accounts for around 65 to 70% of the global EV battery supply chain. CATL alone holds nearly 38% of the global market, supplying power units to brands like Tesla, BMW, and even European car makers trying to compete against Chinese EVs. Meanwhile, BYD, once known as a budget automaker, now rivals Tesla as the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, thanks to its in-house battery systems that are cheaper, safer, and faster to produce. To put it simply, while Europe still debates how to build more gigafactories, China already owns the playbook. From mining lithium and nickel to refining, manufacturing, and recycling, Chinese companies control almost every step of the process. And it's not just scale, it's efficiency. Analysts estimate that a Chinese-made EV battery costs up to 30% less to produce than a European equivalent. That price advantage translates directly into cheaper electric cars for consumers. When you buy a BYD Dolphin for €32,000 instead of a Volkswagen ID, 4 for $37,000, that price gap isn't magic. It's the result of China's deep mastery of battery economics. Europe knows this. That's why its new rules and policies don't just target EV sales. They're aimed squarely at this technological core. The EU isn't demanding access to car designs or software. It's demanding insight into power battery chemistry, production techniques, and supply chain management. Because that's where the real value lies, not in assembling cars, but in controlling the energy that moves them. Yet Europe's timing couldn't be worse. Power battery innovation is accelerating faster than ever, with Chinese firms leading breakthroughs in solid-state batteries, sodium-ion cells, and ultra-fast charging systems. Each advancement widens the gap, making it harder for Europe to catch up unless it somehow gains access to those secrets. And that, ultimately, is what this new tension is about. Europe isn't just fighting to protect its car industry, it's fighting to avoid technological dependence on China for the next generation of transportation. But catching up won't be easy. Even with policies and pressure, Europe faces enormous structural challenges, ones that can't be solved overnight. Europe has never lacked engineering talent or industrial pride. After all, this is the continent that gave the world the first automobile, the assembly line, and some of the most iconic brands in history. But in the electric age, heritage alone isn't enough. The shift from engines to batteries has completely rewritten the rulebook, and Europe is now finding itself years, maybe even decades, behind. The problem starts with the supply chain. Traditional European car makers have always relied on a global web of suppliers, parts from Germany, electronics from Japan, and materials from around the world. But electric vehicles demand something different, a vertically integrated chain that runs from mines to manufacturing. China spent the last 10 years quietly building that network. It invested heavily in lithium mines in South America and Africa, refined the raw materials at home, and developed massive gigafactories capable of producing batteries at incredible scale. Europe, on the other hand, is still struggling to secure reliable access to those same resources. Even when European factories are built, they face another issue: cost. Energy prices in Europe are much higher than in China, labor is more expensive, and regulations are stricter. That means producing a single EV battery cell in Europe can cost 20 to 30% more than in China. This cost difference is devastating in a price-sensitive market, and it's one reason Chinese brands can offer advanced EVs at lower prices without cutting corners on quality. Then there's the labor shortage. Europe's transition to green technology is happening so fast that there simply aren't enough trained workers to fill the new factories being planned. Battery production in particular requires specialized skills in chemistry, material science, and precision manufacturing. Training programs are ramping up, but they can't match the scale and speed of China's industrial system, where hundreds of thousands of workers are already experienced in EV manufacturing. Some European governments have poured billions into subsidy programs to catch up, funding projects like Northvolt in Sweden or new gigafactories in Germany and France. But even with those efforts, the reality is harsh. Building a competitive battery ecosystem from scratch could take at least a decade, and time is exactly what Europe doesn't have. So, faced with this uphill battle, Europe is looking for a shortcut, one that doesn't require starting from zero. That's why it's trying to leverage policy to make Chinese automakers share their technology in exchange for market access. In other words, Europe wants to skip years of research and experience by learning directly from those who already lead the industry. From a strategic perspective, it makes sense. From an ethical one, it's controversial. Is it fair competition, or is it industrial desperation? For China, the answer is clear. No country would willingly hand over the secrets that give it a global edge. And as Beijing pushes back, Europe's shortcut may come with unintended consequences, including the very thing it's trying to avoid, a slow but steady retreat of Chinese investment from European soil. Europe may have expected China to negotiate, to make compromises, to hand over just enough technology to stay in the market. But that's not what happened. Instead of giving in, Chinese automakers began quietly pulling back. By early 2025, several major Chinese companies had already started scaling down their European operations. SVOLT, a leading Chinese battery manufacturer, halted construction of its planned factories in Brandenburg and Saarland, Germany. The company didn't make a big announcement or point fingers. It simply walked away, saying the local policy environment had become too uncertain. Soon after, Leapmotor, one of China's fastest-growing EV brands, ended its partnership in Poland and canceled plans to produce its next model, the B10, in Europe. And Great Wall Motors, another major player, went a step further, closing its European headquarters in Munich and freezing all new expansion projects across the continent. These were not isolated moves. They were signals. Chinese companies had sent a message to Brussels. If you make the rules too harsh, we'll take our business elsewhere. But here's where things get interesting. Despite all these withdrawals and trade barriers, Chinese EVs in Europe kept selling. In fact, sales rose by more than 90% between 2024 and 2025. Market share for Chinese brands doubled, climbing from 2.9% to about 6% in just 1 year. How is that possible? Because even without local factories, European consumers still wanted Chinese cars. Brands like BYD, MG, and NIO offered models that were not only more affordable, but also packed with the kind of advanced technology, long-range batteries, cutting-edge software, rapid charging, that many European models lacked. It's a sign of resilience. Instead of folding under pressure, Chinese automakers adapted. They shifted to export-based strategies, rerouted logistics, and relied on their vast supply chain at home to absorb the impact of tariffs and regulations. Meanwhile, Europe found itself in a strange position. Its policies were meant to protect its car industry, but they also risked alienating the very partners it needed to achieve its own green goals. After all, Europe's push for carbon neutrality by 2035 depends heavily on affordable electric vehicles and reliable battery supply. Without China's massive production base, EV adoption could slow and prices could climb. This standoff has created a new question, one that no one in Brussels seems eager to answer. Who really needs whom more, Europe or China? Europe needs China's batteries, materials, and production efficiency to power its green transition. But China also benefits from Europe's wealthy consumer market, which gives its EV brands global prestige. The relationship isn't one-sided. It's a delicate balance of mutual dependence, where each side holds leverage over the other. And that brings us to the next phase of the story, understanding just how deeply this economic web runs and why untangling it might be harder than either side expected. At first glance, it might look like Europe and China are locked in a zero-sum fight. One side wins, the other loses. But beneath the headlines and political statements lies a far more complicated truth. Both sides depend on each other more than they'd like to admit. Let's start with Europe's side of the equation. To build electric cars, you need a lot more than just factories. You need raw materials like lithium, nickel, graphite, and cobalt, plus the advanced processing facilities to turn them into high-performance batteries. And here, China is in a league of its own. China doesn't just dominate battery manufacturing, it controls 70% of the world's lithium refining, 80% of graphite production, and over 60% of battery component assembly. In other words, even if a European car is made in Europe, chances are the most critical parts inside it, the ones that store and deliver energy, still come from China. That dependence runs deep. In 2023 alone, Europe imported more than 430,000 electric vehicles from China, worth nearly 10 billion euros in trade. Many of these cars weren't even Chinese brands. Some were Teslas, Dacias, and Volvos built in China and shipped back to Europe. This shows how integrated the global EV ecosystem has become, and how difficult it would be for Europe to simply cut China out. On the other side, China also benefits greatly from this relationship. About 40% of all Chinese EV exports go straight to Europe, making it China's single largest overseas market for electric cars. Selling to European consumers doesn't just bring in profit, it brings credibility. When a Chinese EV wins awards or earns positive reviews in Paris or Berlin, it boosts the brand's image worldwide. But here's where the story takes a turn. China is already preparing for a future beyond Europe. It's expanding its markets in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, regions that are eager for affordable EVs and far less restrictive with trade rules. In Thailand and Brazil, Chinese EVs are already becoming bestsellers. In Mexico, new factories are being built to serve both Latin America and North America. This diversification means that while Europe still matters, China is gradually reducing its dependence on it. Europe, however, doesn't have that luxury. It can't easily find another partner that offers the same scale, technology, and cost efficiency in batteries and materials. For all its talk of strategic autonomy, Europe's green transition still runs on Chinese-made power. This makes the trade war a paradox. Both sides are competing fiercely, yet neither can afford to walk away. Europe risks slowing its climate goals and making EVs unaffordable for consumers. China risks losing access to one of the most influential and high-value markets on the planet. It's like two climbers tied together on the same mountain rope. If one slips, the other feels the pull. That's how deep this economic connection runs. But there's still one last question. If protectionism keeps rising and cooperation keeps shrinking, who really pays the price in the end? The answer, as always, may surprise you. As the dust settles on this escalating economic standoff, one thing is clear. Europe's fight to defend its auto industry is also putting its own future at risk. Protectionism can build walls, but it can't build innovation. For over a century, Europe's carmakers stood as symbols of craftsmanship and engineering excellence. But in the electric age, the rules have changed. It's no longer about horsepower or luxury interiors. It's about software, batteries, and speed of innovation. And China, through relentless investment and long-term planning, has mastered those new rules faster than anyone expected. Europe's new tariffs and technology demands might slow the tide of Chinese EVs, at least for a while. But they come at a cost, one that ordinary consumers will feel first. If Chinese cars are priced out of the market, competition drops. And when competition drops, prices rise. The dream of affordable, mass-market electric vehicles, the cornerstone of Europe's green transition, starts to fade. Then there's the bigger picture. Every EV that doesn't make it to the road is one more combustion car that stays on it. Every delayed factory, every disrupted partnership pushes Europe's climate goals further out of reach. Protectionism may protect jobs in the short term, but it also risks slowing the very progress the EU says it wants: a cleaner, faster, more sustainable transportation future. Meanwhile, across the globe, China keeps moving. Its EV industry continues to grow, powered by a self-sufficient ecosystem, from raw materials to recycling. Even as Europe and the US raise barriers, China is finding new customers in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The technology keeps advancing, costs keep falling, and new innovations, like solid-state batteries and AI-driven manufacturing, are already on the horizon. In this light, Europe's defensive stance looks less like strength and more like hesitation, a fear of losing control in an industry it once dominated. But maybe the real question isn't about control. Maybe it's about adaptation. Because technology doesn't stop for anyone. Whether it's steam engines, smartphones, or electric cars, history shows that those who embrace change, even uncomfortable change, end up leading it. Those who resist it fall behind. So now, Europe faces a choice: build bridges with the new global innovators, or keep building walls that may soon box it in. And for consumers, the choice may be just as telling. Would you pay more for a traditional European badge, or choose a Chinese EV that offers more range, more tech, and a lower price? The answer to that question might decide not just the future of the auto industry, but the direction of global power itself. If you want to stay updated on how this global technology war unfolds, from batteries to geopolitics, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. We'll keep breaking down the forces shaping our world's next industrial revolution, one story at a time.